Good morning. Good morning again. Let me extend a warm welcome to all of you to our wonderful city. And I hope that after today's hard work, you will find the time to enjoy it. Thank you for your being here in our fourth symposium. After the recent agreement reached in Paris, environmental policies are becoming more and more important worldwide. The need to reduce emissions in order to reach individual national targets agreed on at the Paris Summit centers attention on the design and implications of environmental policies. The challenge of climate change mitigation makes regulation more and more complex and requires mechanisms to put in place which don't introduce risk and or imbalance in reaching those objectives. In this fourth symposium, we address the issue of energy and environmental policy. Following the recent Paris Agreement, it emphasizes the need for the transition to a low-carbon economy. The transformation of the energy sector is crucial, being the main sector responsible for emissions. For this reason, the development of environmental policy related to the energy sector will be key to the achievement of any environmental objectives. It is precisely on this area that the fourth academic symposium will be focused. Throughout the day, we will participate in a detailed analysis of the objectives and implications of environmental policy in relation to the energy sector. Our first goal is to analyze and discuss how environmental policy can affect the targets set for the energy sector: competitiveness, security of supply, and affordability. We mustn't leave out of this debate the feasible low-carbon alternatives in order to carry out the desired transformation. The deployment of large-scale electricity storage, the continuous use of renewables once they have become technologically mature, and the use of unconventional fossil fuels are examples of those alternatives. Moreover, environmental issues involve a new energy model. These issues affect not only the design of the energy market, but also the model and regulation of the networks. Why? Because the new role of demand and the deployment of renewable energy affects networks, and especially the distribution model. The deployment of smart grids and distributed generation imply not only costs in terms of CO2 from network losses, but also a change in the role of DCOs. The effects of environmental policy on markets and networks are our second focus in this symposium. Without a proper environmental policy, none of these goals are achievable. The complexity of the changes and challenges has great policy implications. How should we design the functioning of markets and the promotion of low-carbon alternatives? What efforts will those policies have on the industry and its competitiveness? How can we found this transformation? The answers to these questions are our third debating topic. The work program of this symposium addresses these issues. At the first table, Mike Watterson, Pablo Del Rio, and Francesco Greceva analyze several alternatives to drive the transition to a low carbon power sector. Storage, renewables, and unconventional oil and gas will be central to the analysis in this session. Improving networks and their conversion into smart grids have significant environmental benefits. Furthermore, the reduction of losses in the transmission and distribution electricity networks also has an impact in environmental terms. And there is an expected effort on environmental policies regarding merging processes in the sector. All those topics will be covered by Elisa Trujillo, María Eugenia Sanin, and Karim Anaya in the second table. The third table deals with environmental policies. Pablo Rodilla, Esther Martinez-Ros, and Christoph Boehringer address different aspects of environmental policy design and their implications for investment and more specific topics such as energy efficiency and industrial policy implications of accommodating affordability and sustainability goals, and where new energy policy mechanisms must be implemented to meet the challenge of climate change mitigation. Chairs discussed Veronica Lenzi, Pablo Del Rio, and Paulina Beato will pose the first questions or the debates and give us some brief conclusions. But our day begins with one of the grids of energy economics. Let me introduce Professor Andreas Löschel. Andreas Löschel holds the chair for Energy and Resource Economics at the University of Münster and is director of the Center of Applied Economic Research, Münster, since 2014. Since 2011, he has chaired the Energy Export Commission of the German government to monitor energy transformation. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the research project Energy System of the Future of the German Academies of Science and of the research platform Energiewende at the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. He is lead author of the Global Environment Outlook of the United Nations Environment Programme between 2014 and 2017, and served as lead author in the Working Group 3 contribution to the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. Between 2007 and 2014, he was head of the Department of Environmental and Resource Economics at the very well-known center in the world, the Center for European Economic Research in Mannheim, and since 2010, Professor of Economics at the University of Heidelberg. He was visiting professor at MIT, Stanford University, Australian National University, Tsinghua University, Beijing, among others. Andreas Löschel studied economics at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, Wayne State University and UCLA. He obtained his PhD from the University of Miami. And could say the year, because as shown, in 2003. His research interests are in applied macroeconomics, energy economics, and economics of climate change. Andreas Löschel advised the European Commission, the European Parliament, the OECD, the World Bank, and national ministries in Germany, Switzerland, and the UK on environmental, energy, and climate change issues. He has published more than 40 articles in journals of the Social Science Citation Index, like Ecological Economics, Economics Letter, Energy Economics, Energy Journal, Environmental and Resource Economics, European Economic Review, Journal of Public Economics, and the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, among many others. The Handelsblatt ranking of German-speaking economists lists him consecutively among the top 100 economists under 40 years between the years 2007-2011. In the ranking of economists of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, he is among the 25 most influential economists in Germany. As I can be noted from my previous words, Professor Löschel has an extensive and prestigious CV and is, of course, one of the most distinguished researchers in the field worldwide. Professor Löschel, Andreas, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you as a keynote speaker in this symposium. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor María Teresa Costa, for this kind introduction. I'm here today actually for the second time because I had the chance to visit your chair last year for a full week, and I know that Barcelona is the academic center of the world. Since this time, I as well know it's the sports center of the world. I could witness how Barcelona was successful this weekend. That was a very nice experience. Yesterday, I as well participated in the workshop, which was indeed an industry workshop, and there the topic was the 2030 perspective and the world after the Paris Agreement. And actually many people in this industry workshop, they were worried about the costs, the cost of all these policies. What would the transformation actually entail for the energy sector, but as well for the industrial base, in the different European member states, in Spain, but as well in other countries. And we had here the Director General of DG Energy, Ristori, which as well, of course, tried to frame this whole issue of what can we afford this. Okay, and this was this will be as well the topic of my talk. And I have to say, like María Teresa, I'm as well into what Martí Parellada framed as public-private partnership. So I'm doing as well a lot of policy advice. And actually, as you have already mentioned, we are as well advising the German government on the energy transformation. And of course, cost issues are really important in this perspective. As you know, the German government initiated what we call the Energiewende around 5 years ago in 2010. They set up a vision of the German energy system in the 21st century, putting up targets for greenhouse gas emissions, for energy efficiency, for energy consumption as well, for renewables in the different sectors, ranging from this greenhouse gas emission reduction target, 40% by 2020, more than 80% by 2050. Renewable targets, we want to achieve as well 35% renewables in 2020 in the electricity sector, more than 80% by 2050. We want to improve our economy's energy efficiency by more than 2% per year. So these are all targets that we can monitor, quantitative targets, and that's the job of this energy expert committee, to see whether we are on track in reaching these different targets of the German energy concept, this Energiewende. There is, of course, a similar discussion on the European scale. Yesterday we have heard the 2020-20 discussion, but more importantly probably the 2030 targets, with these now targets of 30% greenhouse gas reduction or emission reduction, 27 for efficiency in renewables. And of course there again there are quite some good indicators how we are actually achieving this quantitative target. But of course, all these developments have to be framed in, the broader picture of the energy triangle, which means that we should not only look at the environmental impacts. That's easy. We look at greenhouse gas emissions. We should not only look at energy security issues. That's a little bit more complex, but we should as well look at a transformation that's economically viable. And that is a much more difficult task because, of course, if you talk to people, they will have a very different view on what actually is economically viable in this transition. And that is the bottom line of my talk. And I would like to start with a reference to the former German industry commissioner, Oettinger, who's now responsible for IT and technologies. Now, he actually tried to, in his time when he was responsible for DG Enterprise, he tried to frame a fourth target, which was 20% share of industry in the economy. So he wanted to have a fourth target, an industrialization target, looking at the manufacturing base. And if you consider this fourth target, this industrialization target, then you can see that, well, indeed, in Europe, you might conceive that we are in trouble because the manufacturing share decreased in many European countries, most of the European countries actually, and this target of 20% manufacturing share in GDP is not reached by many of these European member states. And it's not only the level, but it's as well the tendency that caught the attention of the European Commission. And of course that's an important issue because if energy costs, and especially if energy costs in the global perspective is putting us on a competitive disadvantage, we can expect that this situation is going to worsen in the future. And you can see that indeed some of our competitors like China and others, they have, or as well Japan, they have much higher shares of manufacturing in their industries. And therefore, it seems important to understand what are the economic implications of this energy transformation and of all these targets that we put up on the environmental side. So costs play a crucial role, and energy costs are, of course, really important, especially as these costs have increased substantially in the last year, and that is due not only to the support of renewable energy. In Germany, the annual bill for the support of renewables amounts to now this year 23 billion euro. That's quite a lot, no? But of course, that's not the only driver of these costs. We as well have large increases in costs for transmission and distribution grid. Yesterday we as well talked about backup capacities and capacity markets, which is as well an additional cost that comes with these transformation. Today we'll talk about storage and so forth. So there are different cost drivers that have to be taken into account. And then, of course, the question always is, well, what is the cost of the transformation? That's, of course, difficult to assess. We will hear this afternoon some modeling studies that try to analyze these additional costs. But then, of course, there are always some assumptions underlying these models, and it's very difficult to communicate this to policymakers. So for our analysis for the German government, we try to use a relatively simple framework to specify these costs. We looked at the electricity or the energy costs for the final consumers. Okay, and we looked at how these final consumer costs developed over time. And here you can see on the left-hand side a graph that is showing the situation for Germany, where actually the electricity costs in real terms amount to around 40 billion euro in the beginning of the 1990s. Then it decreased a bit with the liberalization of the energy markets in Germany. But then since the beginning of the 2000s, which is as well the start of the renewable support scheme in Germany, these costs increased sharply and almost doubled to around 70 billion euro. And then, of course, questions are asked, well, is this affordable? Can we afford this? And therefore, we as well looked at a broader perspective and compared these electricity costs to the GDP to see that what's the share of GDP that we are actually spending on electricity. And if you do that, you get a quite interesting result because back in 1991, we spent around 2.5% of our GDP on electricity, and we spend around the same fraction on electricity today. No? So if you ask about affordability, well, we would say yes, it's affordable. Now, of course, we have invested as well a lot to keep this, to arrange this 2.5%, but we think it's still affordable. But of course, the trend is that this share is increasing over time, and that's something we have to worry about. That's the overall picture, which is describing this cost burden. But usually we focus on electricity prices. We don't look at these overall costs. We look at electricity prices if we talk about competitiveness. And there you get a very mixed picture. I show you here electricity prices for households. So that's, let's see whether I can arrange this. So this is the electricity prices for households, where you see that these prices in Germany are now almost 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So they are really high, doubled in the last 15 years, mainly driven by taxes and by the feed-in tariffs for renewables. So you see that generation and distribution is around 50% of costs. If you look at the wholesale electricity prices in Germany, they are now around 3.5 cents. Okay, so it's only 10% of what households pay for electricity. The picture is a bit different if you look at industry. So that is, that would be car manufacturers, another industry in Germany. They are exempted partly from these feed-in tariffs, but you still see that these prices are around 15 cents per kilowatt hour in Germany, and as well increased quite substantially. Again, they have to pay the full feed-in tariffs. So that's really a large part of their electricity costs. And then lastly, you can look at the very large energy-intensive industry in Germany. That would be aluminum smelters or the steel industry in Germany. If you look at these costs, we don't have exact numbers, but if you look at these costs, you can assume that this is the wholesale price plus about 1 cent, because this industry get a lot of special treatments. They only pay a fraction of the feed-in tariffs. They get rebates on the energy taxes and on the grid charges. So for them, the electricity price looks quite different. Nowadays, it's probably less than 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So you get a very large spread of electricity prices. They vary a lot, of course, then on the specific circumstances. But what is problematic in a way is that, of course, they ignore a lot of factors that are important for our analysis. They ignore the energy efficiency in the different sectors, and they as well ignore the value added that's generated with the use of electricity and the use of fossils in the industry. So therefore, we were not so happy about this type of graphs. Here you can see then the same that I just described, that is now manufacturing industry prices for electricity and industrial gas. So in these medium consumption bands, where you can see, well, the electricity prices increased in most of the member states. Here is Spain. You can find on this side a bit below average. Here you can see then the German situation I showed you here, and then, as I said, this is the medium-size consumers, and I told you that of course the bigger ones have a very different situation in their industrial electricity prices. You can look at the same graph for gas. Again, you would see here Spain. Below average. Germany has actually quite high gas prices in the European situation. So you can do this type of analysis and compare these prices to prices elsewhere in China, in US, and so forth. But I try to convince you that this is only part of the picture if you want to look at these competitiveness issues. Because, of course, prices are important to understand disadvantages for industrial competitiveness in different regions. However, there are other factors that are neglected in these type of comparisons. As I said, the efficiency of these industrial consumers is neglected, and as well the whole industrial efficiency or the value added that's generated with electricity. So therefore, it would be better to look at energy costs in industrial production, looking at a combination of energy input and energy prices, taking into account the efficiency of energy use in these different sectors, and therefore broaden the analysis. If you are looking at competitiveness, for example, and you look at wages, you would as well not compare wages internationally, okay, but you would look at unit labor costs, okay, which tells you, what is actually the value added that's generated by labor input. And the same idea I'm going to present you here. We look at per unit energy costs, like the per unit wage costs, to make comparable the different level of energy prices, electricity prices on the global scale, not just comparing wages or electricity prices, but looking at per unit cost implications. That's, of course, not the end of the story, because, well, we as well know that we would be interested in whether these costs are really carried by the industry or whether they can, for example, be passed on to consumers. That's very difficult, again, to assess. We have done some studies on that, but at the moment, I'm going to neglect this. You should keep that in mind, that of course it's important to look at the level of competition, intensity of competition in the downstream markets to understand better whether these costs are in the end staying with the industry or whether they are just passed on to consumers and therefore are not really endangering this competitiveness situation. As I said, this again requires a bit more econometrics and analysis, and therefore I leave that to colleagues later on, probably. I'm doing something that is much more simple. As I said, we are looking at these energy per unit costs. Here you can see the general concept. I think the slides are going to be distributed, so you can. What is it? On the web page, so you can, if you're interested, you can have a look and read that in detail. The important thing is that what we are doing is we are looking here at these direct energy costs at purchaser prices, which are part then of the total production products that are produced with energy inputs and non-energy inputs, and of course with value added by capital and value added by labor. And then we are relating these direct energy costs to value added in these analysis. And what I'm going to present you as well is an analysis of indirect costs, because in many of the sectors that we are talking about, like for example in Germany, car manufacturing, they have a very small share of direct energy costs, okay, because I mean they use energy, of course, but usually the most part of the energy, as I will show you, is actually embedded in their inputs. So energy price increases will not show up in their direct energy costs, but in the indirect energy costs. No? So therefore, if we want to see how energy price increases is impacting these sectors, we should look not only on the direct impacts, but as well on the indirect impacts. And for all this analysis, I'm going to use the outcome of an EU project that I was participating in called World Input-Output Database, WIRED, which was collecting data, time series data of input-output data for 40 countries over a period of 15 years. And we are using this database for the analysis. I should mention the biggest shortcoming of the database. That was an EU project that was commissioned under the 7th Framework Program, which means that this is data that runs until 2011. And there's a big need to update. Actually, I was as well talking to Dominique Ristori some time ago, asking them for another initiative to do this type of data gathering on international level. Hopefully this is going to be done. We are going to do this for some of the competitors of Germany in the Energy Expert Committee next year, because the German government as well wants to have a better view on these competitiveness implications, comparing Germany not only to the EU neighbors, there it's relatively easy, we have the information, but as well to the US, to China, to Japan and so forth, which is not so trivial. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at some of these sectors, the energy sector, and then these non-energy sectors in the economy. As I said, the total costs, I showed you the number for Germany. The total costs for energy use are pretty significant in Europe, but as well in Germany, in the secondary sectors, in the manufacturing, but as well to some extent in the tertiary sector, that would be indirect costs for this. As I said, I'm going to show you numbers on direct costs and indirect costs. So here you always see the direct costs, and here you see the indirect costs. And now you see these numbers for Germany, for many different sectors. Of course, here you see the energy sectors, coke, refined petroleum, where these direct costs, of course, are the biggest chunk of costs that are incurring. And here you see the different sources of direct costs: electricity, refined petroleum products, natural gas, coal. Okay, and you see the same for electricity generation in the German sectors. And then here you get a very different picture if you look at the sectors that are outside energy. Here you can see that, well, of course there are some sectors that carry a lot of costs. I'm going to relate that to value added in the next stage, but that carry quite some costs, like here the chemical sector, basic metals, for example, but as well transport, of course. And you can see that, well, indirect costs are indeed quite large. In some of these sectors, they are actually larger than the direct cost numbers that you are going to face. So I told you that I would like to relate these cost numbers to a number that shows better the burden of energy costs to firms, and therefore I use this concept of real unit energy cost, which means I'm looking at the share of energy cost to the ratio of energy cost to value added. And here I use this concept of total real unit energy cost that is summing the direct real unit energy costs and these indirect costs together. So here you can see now for this is the secondary sector and the tertiary sector, the energy costs over time now as a ratio to value added. And I'm giving you here a comparison between the German level and the EU level. And this is actually an interesting graph because it shows that in terms of the higher burden of energy costs, Germany is actually doing better than the EU average. So the energy costs for manufacturing sectors related to their value added is actually lower in Germany than in the EU. And in the last years, this gap actually widens. So despite all this discussion that we had, these are the years where the German feed-in tariff really jumped up to this new plateau of more than 5 cents. On the European comparison, we did quite well. While here the costs, of course, as well, not only driven through the electricity price increases, but as well to the increases in oil and coal and gas prices increased further on. You can do the same type of comparison then for the different sectors between Germany and EU. And here you see that, well, first, of course, these per unit energy costs are very different for the different sectors. So, for example, chemical products, they have quite high per unit energy costs, as have these basic fabricated metals. But still, you see again this difference between the German and the European level, giving an implication that the burden for the German companies being quite good in terms of value-added generation is still probably better than compared to many other European countries. Here you can see these, what I just said, the changes in percentage written down between 1995 and 2011. So German increases were actually significantly lower than the increases in per unit energy costs in the European sectors, and that's valid across the board. Okay, now let's broaden a bit the perspective. I've showed you now this EU-German comparison, but what about the global scale? So now here I show you these now only direct per unit energy costs, real unit energy costs in manufacturing sector in a global comparison, using data as well for China, US, Japan. Sorry for missing out Spain in this one. We didn't know when we published this paper that I'm going to sit here a year later. Okay, I will do better next time. So here you can see actually interesting, again, the number for EU27, that's the black line, and you can see Germany, that's the red line, and you can see that, well, Germany is around, well, it's about the same level as UK. It's a bit worse than US in terms of this direct per unit energy cost, but it's doing much better than the EU average. Okay, it's doing much better than Japan and France, for example. And here, just as a gimmick, this is China. So people would always claim, that if you compare, these energy costs between China and Germany, they have a big advantage. Well, if you look at prices, you might be correct. I mean, electricity prices are lower, gas prices are as well somewhat lower. But if you factor in efficiency of production, you get a totally different picture. And if you as well account for the value-added generation, where China has specialized in relatively low value-added sectors, now you can see that, well, Germany actually can deal with these energy costs, of these high energy prices, actually better than some of their competitors. Okay, so this is the global picture. Now, since I'm talking a bit long, I'm probably skipping some of this. I wanted to show you, that's more for the paper that we are producing on that, I guess, then. The direct versus indirect perspective. So how important are direct costs, indirect costs? How important are domestic energy costs and imported energy costs? Of course, you can as well face energy cost increases that are coming through your imported goods. So you're actually affected by price increases somewhere else, okay? Which might be important for, of course, an open economy that is actually importing a lot of goods, and then re-exporting them. You could as well look at the importance of primary energy versus secondary energy. So how important is electricity price versus how important is the price changes in coal, oil, and gas for your economies. Okay. Okay. So I told you already that in many sectors the direct costs are important. That relates especially to the energy sector. The indirect are important, but here in the energy sector, of course, that's not the case. That's driven by direct cost. Not so much in the other sectors. That's what I said in the very beginning. If we look at primary energy versus secondary energy, then you can see that, in fact, the secondary energy is more important for most of the sectors. So it's really not so much the electricity cost that is important, but it's probably more the costs for transport, heating, which is based on fossil fuels. I've shown you this picture for Germany with the 70 billion electricity costs for end users, which is 2.5% of German GDP. You can do the same calculations for gas for heating and for transport. There you can see that electricity is actually really smaller than the expenses we have for mobility. It's about the same level as expenses we have for heating, and that's of course as well shown then in these graphs for the different sectors. Okay, so this is for electricity costs, and here you say, we pose the question, well, at this point in time, electricity was probably not a big driver, because if you look at the secondary cost numbers or secondary energy carrier numbers, here electricity impacts for these different sectors, you can see that these numbers are relatively flat in the 2000s. So it's probably not really so important, at least for this time we looked at. It's different if you look at petroleum products, for example, in this sector. And I would like to finish with one sectoral picture that might summarize a bit what we find in the data, and this picture is showing the real per unit energy cost, now only the direct cost for the chemical industry in Germany, which, as you might know, is a very important industry in Germany, and of course one that is hit a lot by energy cost increases. And there I show you two panels. The one on the left-hand side is the direct energy per unit cost from gas and oil. That's this one here, okay? And the other side is from electricity. Okay, and I show you again this international comparison. And then, okay, you can see Germany here. And you can see Germany here. So the pictures are really very different if you look at gas and oil, where Germany is actually on top of these comparisons compared to EU 27, UK, Japan. So indeed, the energy cost per value added in the chemical sector is higher than many of the competitors, while the picture is different for the electricity and steam inputs. Here, the German chemical sector is doing much better than the rest of the world, with much lower costs. And that is interesting, because this here, that's exogenous. That's not driven by the German energy transformation. That's global oil price developments, gas prices in the chemical sector, of course. So nothing, or very little policymakers can do. Yesterday we heard that, of course, they should do something as well for lowering gas prices and gas energy security. But I mean, this one is probably more exogenous, to policymakers than this one, which is driven by electricity prices. And there it seems that, at least for the German case, the German government, they actually were successful in striking a balance between competitiveness issues on the one hand and this environmental concern driving the energy transformation on the other one. At least we cannot see until 2011 that we are really in a big disadvantage to some of our competitors. That might have changed in recent years. At least that's the argument I'm hearing a lot. We are going to look at that. I think this will not play out, because I mean, between 2011 and 2015, many of the energy transformation costs increased indeed, but I would claim that the German industry was sheltered by against most of these increases. So I would not suspect that a lot changed actually, but we are going to see that by the end of the year in our next report. So to finish up, what I wanted to do today, I wanted to describe you a little framework how to look at these issues of energy prices, cost, and competitiveness. As I said, we are doing one step more than we often see in these type of comparisons. It's still not perfect, so of course we want to have more ex post type of evaluation using firm level data within the country or as well between different countries, and we are as well doing that, but that is much more complicated, of course, than what I've shown you here. My point is that we need indeed a broader discussion that's not only looking at energy prices. We should develop these type of indicators. Actually, DG Economic Affairs is as well doing the same type of calculations for the European Commission, looking at these per unit energy costs. So I think that is a good set of indicators. We know that this data has to be improved because the differences within sectors are really large. So now here these are input-output tables that are still quite aggregated. And of course, if you go to a more disaggregated level, like NACE 4 level that we are using, for example, for the EU emission trading scheme, we will see a lot of differences between subsectors. But this data is at the moment not available. We need that for a better disaggregation. We need it as well to extend this time series beyond 2011 in order to make this information better. So what's the situation concerning energy costs and competitiveness in Germany and Europe? We have seen that indeed these policy costs have increased, and of course we know that a lot of costs are actually in the future, because in Germany we have now achieved 30% of renewables. Well, we want to achieve 80%, and I guess this 80% will be much more expensive than the first 20% that we achieved in the last 15 years. So a lot of these costs are actually on top. So what we need is we need really a better understanding of economic efficiency in the implementation of this transformation that relates to renewable policies. That's not a good example of an economic policy in Germany. And we see that even the German government claiming that they're going to make it more market-oriented. This is probably not going to be the case. So we have to push for this efficiency, because it's crucial as well for keeping costs down. That's as well true for the further development of climate policies. If you think about some of these policies we are seeing today in Germany, it's really problematic. So, for example, German government is now discussing a coal phase-out, which should be administered by subsidies to the coal firms. But they do that now for 4 or 5 installations. That's probably still doable, but obviously, I mean, we cannot use these type of policy approaches to really reach targets that we have agreed on in the Paris Agreement. So that will not be possible. So we need market-based approaches. We need a better ETS, a broader ETS that is doing that, and a better renewable policy that is aligned with it. At the moment, we think the costs are still under control, even though there's as well a lot of discussion on distributional issues. I showed you that, of course, sheltering some of these industry sectors, will put additional costs on the households. And this discussion is as well accelerating in Germany. Energy poverty is starting to be an issue. We need a European vision for that. And we heard yesterday that there are, of course, some issues that can be done. I've not heard a vision on, for example, a European renewable support. Being here in Spain, I think it's probably better to have more PV installation in Spain than in Germany. And nothing against the German weather, but obviously it's better here. And we need some policies that are driving these type of changes. We need a global approach, because we are talking about level playing field. Okay, and then of course these national determined contributions coming out of the Paris Agreement. It's totally unclear what a level playing field in these contributions are. And so I hope that this energy cost assessment might be as well helpful for determining this level playing field in international comparisons, because there it's totally unclear what should be the yardstick in looking at these commitments by different nations. And that's important because we know that sub-global cooperation is problematic, and we really need these global views. Otherwise, we provoke policy responses, and if we have these larger differences, then of course we will have the further discussion on carbon leakage, on border carbon adjustment, and all the problems that come along with that. So it's clear that this picture has to be broadened, and as I said, we try to provide some analytical tool to understand better this global dimension. Okay, thanks a lot.
Many thanks, Andreas, for your excellent presentation. I suppose there are a lot of suggestions and questions on the floor. Who breaks the fire? Okay, Antonio Hernandez, por favor. Here, Jess, please.
Thank you very much, Maite, and thank you very much, Andreas. Only one question concerning Germany and the prospects in renewables, and in particular in offshore wind. So my question is, if you have any analysis of the implication of these offshore wind targets in energy cost for Germany.
Yeah. Well, I have to admit that our first report, when we wrote our first report to the government in 2011, we asked them to skip the offshore wind target. Because offshore wind is by far the most expensive policy now that we have now in the whole system. But I have to say that I learned that this is more driven by industrial policy type of considerations. You know that the German utilities, of course, they are facing big problems at the moment, and most of them have now started to move into offshore wind investments. So this is really seen as the big new project for many of the utilities, and therefore politically that is something that is going to be supported heavily. And we think that most of the increases in the feed-in tariff system are actually coming out of the new wind investments that we are seeing. We expect the feed-in tariff to be increased by around 2 cents in the next 3-4 years by the new offshore windmills that are going to be in operation. That will be really the biggest driver, because nowadays for new PV installations, you get around 9 to 14 cents, depending. Rooftop PV gets something like 14 cents of feed-in tariff. Wind gets 7.5 cents now with the new EEG reform. So these costs have been coming down a lot. in recent years, while for the wind farms, I mean, offshore wind, it's difficult because they have started to introduce different support schemes, and if you add them up, you might end up in numbers that are probably around 25 cents per kilowatt hour. And even industry is not very optimistic about potential for cost decreases. New study published last year foresee cost decrease in offshore wind parks of around 20% in the next 10 years. So that's very costly.
Thanks, Andreas. Another place here. Yeah, en aquest costat, sisplau. I appreciate very much if you can present it yourself.
Thank you. Good morning. Which is the secret beyond the low direct energy, or electricity and steam prices in Germany?
What is the
reason? Because
okay. For the reason for the low price.
the graph
Okay.
showed
Yeah.
there was a big gap.
Yeah.
So there might
Yeah.
be some
Well,
structural reasons.
Yeah. There are structural
you.
reasons. The one reason is that our feed-in tariff system is not linked to developments on wholesale electricity prices. No, so you get your feed-in tariff, guaranteed for 20 years, and the government, has pushed these installations heavily in the last years, which means that we have a lot of electricity on the market. I mean, already we have quite some excess capacity still in Germany, at least for the years to come. And now these renewables entered the market now in many hours of the year, and that led to these decreases in the wholesale electricity price. So now 3.5 cents in Germany, which is the lowest level since more than 10 years, actually. And on the other hand, we have an escalation of charges, taxes that are put on household electricity prices. I already talked about the feed-in tariffs. That's more than 6 cents that have to be paid by the households and by industry, not by the large consumers I showed you. But for the rest, they have to pay the 6 cents, which is already much more than the wholesale electricity price. Plus, the grid charges in Germany are as well relatively high. So in many locations, you pay 7 cents grid charges, which are put on top. And again, the big industry installations, they get a discount for the grid charges as well. So most of them pay only a fraction of the grid charges. The same is true for the electricity tax. And that explains to a large extent this variation in the energy or in the electricity prices in Germany.
Yeah, please. Could you present yourself?
Sorry?
Could you present?
Yes, of course.
Please.
My name is Nina. I'm a PhD student in business administration of the University of Barcelona. My question, it's more about a concern rather than question, is that here in Spain, in general in the world, energy sector is very dependent on politics, and politics are very dependent in some cases on the interests of gigantic companies like Repsol, Endesa, Fenosa, and all those beautiful labels that we see here. And those companies, they might not like this feed-in tariff and the promotion of clean energy sector. So what we face here in Spain is that recently there was the tax issued that made it almost not possible to install your panel, your solar panel in your house and produce clean energy. Now it's not that efficient. Now it's not that economically profitable for us, for users. So do you have this problem of lobbying interests of gigantic companies, energy companies in Germany, and how do you deal with it?
Okay. Well, actually, in Germany it's not different than in Spain in terms of course, there's a lot of stakeholder interest in energy policy. I mean, just today the Chancellor is sitting together with the heads of the German car manufacturing sector discussing subsidies on electric vehicles, and of course you can see that in all parts of the discussion that stakeholders are very involved in the energy transition. And of course we are a bit worried about that, and it's not only the energy companies. I mean, that's really broad. I just talk about car manufacturing. They are now asking for 2 billion support of electric vehicles, which, of course, you could as well question Volkswagen having a research budget of 13 billion. Why they need another 2 billion for the government. It's probably not easy to understand, but of course there's a lot of pressure from all these places, and as well from the renewables. I mean, in Germany, I think probably the situation is different from Spain, that we have as well a lot, of vested interest in renewables. If you think about RWE and E.ON, the two biggest energy companies, they have now split up their business in two parts. One being the conventional units, and one being the renewables. So this is, I mean, it's not clear, what this entails. But obviously, there's a big part of E.ON, Uniper now called, the old one is Uniper, and the new is E.ON, sounds better, and RWE, which are based on renewables and grids. So they have quite an interest in continuation of this energy transformation. And in Germany, we have about 1.3 million households with rooftop solar. So I would say it's not that easy. I mean, I'm worried about this tendency, of course, but I mean, it's not so clear who is playing what. I mean, there are a lot of interests, and this year. We said, we wrote in our report, and that was quite heavily cited, everybody knows that climate policy is expensive, and reaching this Paris Agreement is expensive, okay? But people are only willing to accept some policy, if it's for their personal benefit, which of course I can totally understand, but I mean, this concept is not going to work for the whole energy transformation. I mean, if this is a Christmas tree and everybody can hang his wishes on, then this is not going to be affordable, and that's as simple as it is.
Jump points? It's from the
two questions
enterprise.
regarding your excellent presentation. One is there any procedure opening by the European Commission regarding this policy of charging the bigger part of the cost to the domestic users and leaving the big industry without? And second, the Energiewende have made a paradoxical result. It is that there's a lot of renewables, and Germany is increasing every year strongly their emissions by use of coal. I think this is possible because in the European trading scheme now the price of CO2 is very cheap. But if it would get a reasonable price, I think this policy would be quite difficult. So what is your opinion about those topics?
Yeah. Okay. So I should be careful since we're taped. No, but of course, I mean, the European Commission is following closely this competitiveness issue. You can be assured, and you know that there was an investigation in the feed-in tariff system 2 years ago, and the German government was very strict on pushing forward their own view, and the Commission backed up a bit, and allowed the Germans, but there will be another review in 2017. And I'm pretty sure that the Commission is at the moment collecting some evidence of these problems that are emerging in terms of competitiveness implication for the internal market. Because in the end, of course, I've shown you the consequences of this policy. There is you can see that there are quite some benefits for some of the bigger users out of these policies, and these policies are paid for by the consumers. And we are not sure to what extent this really plays out. That will be something the Commission is going to put forward next year, but I'm sure that they are going to do that. And honestly, we as well discussed that already with DG Competition and other players. Concerning Concerning gas, I mean, I think you're perfectly right. Emissions in Germany have stayed the same or even increased in the last 5 years. Last year, actually, they increased. 2 years ago, they decreased, but that was mainly due to good weather. Indeed, I mean, we are totally not on track. Actually, we as well think that we might miss our 40% target in CO2 reduction, so there's obviously a problem. The gas power plants in Germany were not used a lot in the past. Actually, just this month it turned a bit around because of the sharp decrease in gas prices. But we think that we need CO2 prices that are quadruple of what we see today, to make this shift. But actually, I am personally, I'm trying to promote this idea. If Germany wants to stick to its CO2 targets, then it would be the best to think about raising the CO2 prices in some coordinated way, because what they are doing now, phasing out coal, is of course much more costly from an economic point of view than trying to increase CO2 prices, which, from the perspective of damages should be anyway more 30 euro than 6 euro. So it would make not only sense from an environmental economics point of view, but it would as well open up quite some cheap possibilities. And we know that the switch prices between coal and old coal and new gas in Germany should be around 20 euro at the moment. That is not out of reach, and that would be a much easier policy, of course, in order to reduce emissions coming out of coal, because at the moment, with coal prices, with ETS prices, coal is simply competitive, and brown coal and soft coal constitute more than 40% of the German electricity mix, and of course we are not going, and we are even we are even cheaper than our neighbors, so we are as well exporting a lot of this electricity to our neighbors. So we, if we are really serious about this transformation and as well the CO2 targets that are lying behind, we have to find some way on improving the carbon pricing content.
Just the last one question, because, two. One and the last here.
Hello, thank you very much. This is Antonio Martinez from Kikino Energy. I would like to ask, what do you think about this conclusion, harmonization of renewable support around all European countries?
Yeah. Well, as I said, we have. If you look at the EU 2030 targets, you can see that there is the ETS. As a European instrument, but if it comes to renewables, then we stick to an implementation that is more or less on the member state level. And of course, it would make sense to think about, if you want to stick to a renewable target, to think about a mechanism that allows for an achievement of these 27% of renewables that takes into account the best sites that we have in Europe. And they might probably not be in Germany. So having a European approach to renewable support would be, I think, a very good thing to consider. And at the moment, we don't have that. There was some discussion. I was as well testifying at the European Parliament in 2007 to include that already in the 2020 decision. Actually, it's there, but nobody cares about it, because there's actually possibility to trade your renewable obligations as well under the 2020 pact, but nobody's doing it. We should have something similar under the 2030 agreement, I think. So some countries can do more, others probably do less, depending on the costs that are going ahead with that are related to their renewables, and that I think would be beneficial as well for the southern European countries, and it would as well make sense in terms of economic costs that are associated. How this is implemented, that can be discussed. In Germany, there is quite some resistance against green certificate schemes. So I don't want to be too simplistic because that will be very difficult to implement in Germany, but there might be as well, as I said, probably some possibility to differentiate these targets, and think about not only differentiate the target, but as well think about financial transfers, that are then going along with this differentiated target.
Please.
Good morning. I'm Francesco Graceva from Enea, the Italian National Energy Agency. I appreciated very much the presentation because something we would like to do, we plan to do a similar monitoring of costs in Italy because it's important for the Italian industry, which is not so far from the German one. My question is about, I like very
Just
much
a moment because it's not working.
Yes, shall I start? No, okay. No, I'll go directly to the question. I appreciate very much the discussion that you link energy prices, then to cost, and then to competitiveness, looking at this real unit energy cost. My question is, are you also working about the last step of the analysis, which means from total direct and indirect energy cost to GDP, how this can affect GDP? And or I don't know if you are working on this or how to do that. And I was thinking that maybe, I think personally that a good idea for analysis, for this kind of analysis would be to look at the recent trends in the US, where you had this, in the last 5-7 years, a huge decrease in gas prices. And then the question is how much this change did affect in a positive way, of course, the GDP, US GDP.
Yeah.
Because, of course, we are talking, as you said, about less than 20% of GDP is in industry, and then the share of energy costs, direct plus indirect, in the industry, in the most energy-intensive sector, is still something like between 5 and 10%. So if you multiply all this, then...
Well, as I said, that's a difficult question. Of course, you can try to make this relation, but I think probably doing this on a more macro scale is not really being so good in terms of identifying really causal effects. And you're, of course, interested in the causal effects between the impacts on the sectors and the GDP. So what we have been doing is more looking at on the firm level, because there then we can as well see whether these changes in electricity costs or energy costs is actually affecting the firms, the production of firms, but as well relocation of firms. And I think that is then a potential way as well to measure better the causal implications of these policies with firm-level data. And so that is something that we've been doing. Other people has as well started to do that with new administrative data, as well, for example, in the context of the EU ETS. And there are some papers that try to relate then ETS prices, for example, to competitiveness of firms, measured, for example, in their exports outside Europe. And there, I think the evidence is that at the moment this really has no negative impact on these companies because, as I have described for Germany, the situation is similar in the EU ETS due to these special measures on competitiveness for the energy-intensive trade-imposed industries. Most of them get quite some free certificates in the ETS, and therefore are as well to some extent sheltered by these cost increases. So at the moment we don't really see scientifically an indication of negative impacts as well if you look at firm level data. But as I said, this is relatively new research because these databases are opened up really only recently. ETS is not that old, and we are as well now using administrative data for Germany to look at these issues. I think that's, research-wise, I think that's quite interesting for the future.
Thanks. We need to follow the time, the program, but let me just to to say some words. Firstly, obviously, we appreciate a lot, and thank you for your excellent conference. Also, it could be interesting, remember, for us, for Spanish people, that really the interesting results that the manufacturing sector present in your slides is not isolated from other results of the German sector. The energy cost effects are not a question that could be explained only from energy sector. It's a question that it is necessary to explain from manufacturing sector, because if the manufacturing enterprises don't invest in innovation, in changing their products, in improve the sustainability, the substitution of inputs more efficient, introduce more efficient inputs, obviously the effects of the energy costs are going to be much more important. It's not a question, in our case in Spain, of energy enterprises, even though people don't know that and confuse the situation, because energy sector is very difficult to understand. Our price, the price of the electricity we pay consumers, have two components. And energy cost is very low, as low as in the other European countries. And that is the price, that is the part of the price fixed by the market. The other part of the price are costs fixed by the government and other enterprises. Some of these components could be or are really necessary to include in the final price, other no. It's for that it's necessary to understand the things when we compare our situation with Germany. Germany is a very good example, obviously not only in energy policy, also in industrial policy, as the presentation of Andreas shows. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you a lot.
Thanks.